This is lesson 25 in module 15. This is the final lesson of the course. Today we will take a look at the RMF again and relate it to the course overall. We will also have a short review for the final exam. Okay, remember this diagram? Let's begin the lesson by reviewing it. NIST Special Publication 800-37 introduces a 7-step risk management framework as displayed in this diagram from the document. The steps are: prepare the organization by establishing a context and priorities for the organization to manage security and privacy risks. Categorize the system and the information process stored and transmitted by the system based on an analysis of the potential impact should the item be lost. Select the initial set of controls for the system using NIST Special Publication 800-53 and the controls found in that document, for example. Tailor the controls as needed to reduce risk to an acceptable level based on a risk assessment. Implement the selected controls and describe how the controls are used. Assess the controls to determine if the controls are implemented, operating, and producing the desired outcomes. A senior official will authorize the system to operate based on a determination that the risk to the organization is acceptable, and monitor the system and the associated controls continuously to ensure the controls are working and no other factor has changed the potential impact. Here is another diagram we've looked at before. It really sums up in many ways the overall thrust of what we're looking at this semester. In one of the optional videos in the course, the speaker mentioned that he is not a big fan of the RMF as it basically is big and evolved. I won't strictly disagree with this, but he has missed a major point. While the two can build on each other, there is a very basic difference between implementing something like the CSF and implementing the RMF. The CSF would fall into the category of what we refer to as a maturity-based approach. You start with a baseline of some sort and build upon that as your organization matures its security processes. A risk-based approach, on the other hand, examines the cybersecurity risks to your organization. With a maturity-based approach, you implement the security controls detailed in the list of controls for the level you are at or are trying to achieve. You may eliminate some of them simply if they don't apply to your organization, but the prioritization of risks generally is not part of the process. This is not to say that you can't utilize the CSF for a risk-based approach. It is just normally associated with maturity-based approaches, such as the Center for Internet Security's implementation groups. A risk-based approach looks at what risks your organization does face and then attempts to prioritize them in terms of which are the most important to address, as they are the ones most likely to happen or have the greatest impact if they do. Most organizations will start off implementing a maturity level approach as they are the easiest to understand and to implement. They aren't, however, necessarily the best approach. As you improve your understanding of cybersecurity, you can transition to a more risk-based approach, as this chart implies. If an organization has no existing risk management or cybersecurity program, a maturity-based approach will most likely be the best first approach. What I have created in the next few slides is a way to illustrate how I might approach working with an organization on their cybersecurity program and risk management of their systems. One thing you could do to help organize this so it specifically relates to the RMF would be to include with which step of the RMF each of my bullets belongs to. I included a few of these to illustrate what I mean. Be forewarned, however, that my bullets on these slides do not necessarily go in lockstep with the RMF. Let's just quickly step through the slides, after which we will look at the RMF in greater detail. How might you approach risk management for an organization? I would propose there are at least two different approaches an organization could take depending on their level of maturity, their cybersecurity maturity. This is the first approach, a risk-based approach that I might take for a more cyber-secure organization, with employees who are cybersecurity professionals. The bullet statements basically provide guidance on the steps you might take in helping an organization implement this approach. This is the second approach. In this case, this is a maturity level approach which I would use for organizations that were not very mature in their cybersecurity program. Again, the bullets are high-level steps you could take in helping an organization implement this approach. This slide and the last might be considered the two extremes, and you could take a hybrid approach somewhere between the two. Whichever approach you choose, one of mine or one of your own, which might be a hybrid of the two, you will need to select the security controls the organization will implement. You will also need to cover some specific cybersecurity related plans as outlined in this slide. During the course, I also pointed out there could be some other considerations you might need to keep in mind, such as if you have an OT network, or if you are processing controlled unclassified information, or if you are working with an organization that works with the DoD or DOW, in which case you will need to utilize a CMMC. Another possible consideration is if the organization you are working with is a member of a sector, such as one of the critical infrastructures, that has its own required best practices or regulatory requirements they must comply with. Listed here were a few other items discussed during the course that you need to include after you have accomplished the details on the previous slides. At this point, there are three other elements that a program really should include. These are monitoring, information sharing, and training, testing, and exercises. Each of the slides outlining how I might address working with an organization that I've just gone through include as much as possible documents that you could use in conducting each item I listed. They are pointers for where you can go for more information on the item. Let's now take a look at a bit more organized approach using the RMF as the model we follow. This will in many ways provide a summary of what we have examined this semester. We looked at the RMF diagram and defined each of the 7 steps in the process. Let's now break them down to the individual tasks that I would suggest we should be concerned with. The first step is prepare, which is divided into 2 sets of tasks, organizational level and system level. These 2 sets in the prepare step include a lot of tasks that set up the remaining RMF steps. Task P2 has you establishing a risk management strategy for the organization. Task P3 states you should assess risks and update the risk assessment. This, of course, means that you have to have conducted a risk assessment, which I believe is a bit early. Task P4 tells you to establish your control baselines and CSF profiles. This also seems a bit early, and we will see a later task that also addresses baselines, but more on that in a few minutes. Task P6 has you prioritizing systems into groups of systems at the same impact level. This is definitely something that I would do in a preparation step. Finally, Task P7 introduces monitoring. Not that you start monitoring at this point, but you develop a strategy to do so later. Moving along, Task P8 is our first one at the system level. This further expands on what we started in P6 by determining which systems are needed for which function. It goes along with Task P10 that identifies what assets you have that require protection. Task P12 continues with the identification of what is most important, but now not based on the function, but rather on the type of information processed. Task P14 is where we are to conduct a risk assessment. I, however, disagree with this definition used by NIST, which I believe I discussed in an earlier lesson. NIST basically equates a risk assessment and a risk analysis. In our lessons, we say that a risk analysis is conducted on a system and a risk assessment considers all of the individual system risk analyses. Notice that this task specifically states you conduct a system level assessment. At some point, you need to consider all systems collectively so you can prioritize the risks, which is what an assessment is supposed to do. Task P15 has you identify what is needed to secure the system. This is approaching selection of security controls, but you can't really do this on an individual basis, so you simply describe what the security issue is and what would be needed to secure the system without picking a control. Task P17 goes with P15 in identifying the security requirements for the system, but then also looks at the operational environment. Notice that I have not included all of the tasks in the list I have laid out here. I view these tasks as the essential ones that you need to include. This does not mean the others are not helpful or useful. I was just attempting to shrink the list a bit so it is not so overwhelming. The next step in the RMF is categorize. There are actually not a lot of tasks in this step, and even fewer that I want to highlight. In fact, only one. Task C2 has you identifying the system categorization. Again, they are looking at a system as opposed to the organization. In order to accomplish this, the description for this task points you to some documents that we looked at earlier that will help you determine the category for the system, specifically FIPS 200 and CNSSI 1253. Next, we move on to the select step, where we are supposed to determine what security controls we should implement. Task S1 specifically states this. It tells us to select the controls for the system, again, system, but it doesn't mention looking at this system in relationship to other systems. I want to point out something that they mention in the discussion for this task, something that we discussed previously, but that is not stressed in the NIST publications. They state there are two approaches for the initial selection of the controls. The first is a baseline. The second is organization-generated control selection. The wording isn't exactly what we used when we discussed the two approaches. Basically, I would argue that the baseline approach is what we referred to earlier to as a maturity-based approach, and the organization-generated control selection is more of a risk-based approach. NIST doesn't talk about maturity levels, but selecting your controls on a baseline is what we have discussed when we're examining different approaches, such as using the CIS controls at IG1, IG2, or IG3. And when you implement an organization-generated selection approach, you are taking a look at the real needs for the organization and not relying on a baseline maturity level structure or a list of common practices. Task S2 has you tailoring the controls, if needed, to the system and environment, and Task S3 goes along with this as you allocate the controls. Task S5 expands upon your monitoring plans now that you have the specific controls identified. And Task S6 is a review by the authorizing official. The authorizing official or designated representative may recommend changes to the security and privacy plans. Next comes the implement step. This really only has two tasks. Task I1 simply states that you are to implement the controls that were selected and authorized. Task I2 requires you to document what you've done in terms of what was actually implemented. We next come to the assess step of the RMF. Remember that this is not the same thing as conducting a risk assessment for the organization. It is an assessment of the controls you have put in place to ensure they are doing what you had wanted them to do. Tasks A1, A2, and A3 can be grouped together in my opinion. A1 has you selecting who is going to assess the controls. A2 consists of developing a plan for the assessment, and A3 then is the actual assessment of the controls. These are actually 3 separate tasks, but they group together nicely. Task A4 involves you developing a report of the findings for the assessment. This logically follows what you did in Task A3. Task A5 is interesting. It states you are to conduct the initial remediation actions of the assessments. But isn't that what selecting the controls was all about? The remediation of the risks with the system? Well, yes, but remember what this assessment is about. It is verifying that the controls are doing what you wanted. If one or more of them is not, then something else must be done. Task A6 might be a bit confusing since it talks about creating a plan to fix things based on the assessment that was just accomplished. But didn't we address this in Task A5? Well, in this case, the plan of action and milestones describes the actions that are planned to correct deficiencies in the controls identified during the assessment of the controls and during continuous monitoring. The plan of action and milestones includes tasks to be accomplished with a recommendation for completion before or after system authorization. So yes, you can get these done before the authorize step, which is the next step, or they can be accomplished according to the plan later. After you've implemented everything or have a plan for remediation activities for some risks, as we just discussed in Task A6, we move on to the authorize step. The first task, R1, is simple to understand. You create the authorization package that you are going to forward to the individual responsible for authorizing the system to process with the controls that have been implemented. This is an important step with government agencies, but in industry, especially for smaller businesses, this step is a much less formal process. Still, somebody is going to have to say, yes, everything looks sufficient, press on. This may just be based on a briefing to the CIO or CISO, CISO for the business, or it may be based on an informal written report. Task R2 can be misconstrued, but if you read the description, you can see this is just the official analyzing the report you provided in Task R1 to decide whether everything is sufficient to proceed with the controls now in place or that will be completed according to the milestones created in Task A6. Task R3 provides the opportunity to further select mitigation strategies, which can include acceptance for any remaining risks. What you are looking at are the residual risks after implementation of the current controls. Task R4 would seem to go with the previous task R3, but it is separated in the RMF. This task has you deciding if the risks or the plan to mediate are sufficient. You could combine the two tasks, in my opinion. Task R5 consists of reporting what the decision is in terms of authorizing to process. One might ask why this task is needed and isn't just part of the previous task, but it is important to note that the RMF states reporting occurs only in situations where organizations have delegated the authorization functions to levels of the organization below the head of the agency. So, if when you submitted the authorization package it went to the head of the organization, then this step does not apply. It only applies when you have somebody who makes a recommendation to the head of the organization. Another interesting part mentioned in this task is authorizing officials report authorization decisions for systems and common controls to designated organizational officials, so the individual risk decisions can be viewed in the context of organization-wide security and privacy risk to organizational operations and assets, individuals, other organizations, and the nation. As we've seen, many of the tasks are specifically looking at a system and not the organization. And finally, here we look at the risks organization-wide. We've mentioned monitoring a number of times throughout the semester. In terms of the specific tasks identified in this step, several really go together. For example, I would put M1 and M5 together. You monitor your systems on a continuous basis and report on your current security status to management. This keeps security on everybody's mind. When I say they go together, I don't mean that we combine them into one task. We should still keep them separate in that respect. But the one M5 logically fits with and follows is task M1. I would then propose that M2, M3, M4, and M6 also go together. With M2, you make sure the controls are working adequately. Then in M3, if you determine there is now a level of risk that is not acceptable, you need to respond to it. M4 then has you updating your plans to take care of what needs to change, and M6 basically summarizes what needs to be done. The last task, M7, basically is talking about system disposal, which means how do you get rid of your resources when they are replaced or are no longer needed. We've addressed a number of different documents during the course, and we've looked at a variety of different ways to approach cybersecurity. We've just accomplished a review of the RMF, which, coming from NIST, you would expect it to be the definitive guidance on risk management. But I pointed out some places that things are a bit different than what we've discussed. So what are some of the differences between the RMF as we just reviewed it and some of the other guidance given during the course? I would start off with the difference between a risk assessment and a risk analysis. The definition of a risk assessment from the glossary of 800-37 is shown. Notice, as I pointed out in the discussion of the task, that NIST refers to the risk assessment in terms of what impact a system can have on the organization. I prefer and think it is more appropriate to refer to this as a risk analysis, and a risk assessment then is the cumulative assessment of all risks from all systems. The RMF doesn't really discuss what needs to be accomplished before you conduct your risk assessment, such as identify threats, vulnerabilities, etc. In fact, it doesn't tell you what the process is for conducting a risk assessment. You need to refer to another document for this, NIST SP 800-30, the Guide for Conducting a Risk Assessment. These two documents should be used together. Notice that the definition of a risk assessment in 800-30 is slightly different than that found in 800-37. 800-30 adds estimating and prioritizing, which I've highlighted, and that we know is a critical part of a risk assessment. It also adds an additional sentence, the second bullet shown here. Here it lets you know that a threat analysis as well as a vulnerability analysis should be part of the risk assessment. It also needs to take into consideration any mitigation strategies, such as from security controls. Unfortunately, it ends the sentence with the statement that a risk assessment is synonymous with risk analysis. You can find numerous other documents and websites as well as if you ask Copilot the question, that will tell you they are different and that a risk assessment includes a risk analysis. Much of what the RMF addresses is system-based and not organizationally based. This is somewhat alleviated when you utilize 800-30 to define your risk assessment process. The NIST RMF tasks seem to jump around a bit at times instead of proceeding from task 1 to task 2 to task 3 and so forth through each of the steps of the RMF. I prefer a more prescriptive process that proceeds from one step and task to the next, and if you need to go back to the previous step or task, you state this. I would be afraid that a novice using the RMF might lose track of their process. If you're going to use 800-37 to follow your risk management plan and to implement the RMF, you need to also understand 800-30, which is an important companion document that tells you how to conduct a risk assessment. The process, as shown in this diagram from 800-30, shows 4 steps in the process. Prepare for the assessment. Here you identify the purpose and scope of the assessment along with any assumptions and constraints. You will also identify the risk model and method to be used to conduct your assessment. Next, you conduct the assessment. Then you communicate the results. This step is shown on the left side of the diagram. And finally, you maintain the assessment, which is shown on the right side of the diagram. Step 1 in a risk assessment is to prepare for the assessment. It consists of 5 specific tasks. The first task, 1-1, has you identify the purpose of the risk assessment. Task 1-2 is intended to outline the scope of the risk assessment. Task 1-3 lays out any intended assumptions and constraints that may apply to the risk assessment. Task 1-4 requires you to identify the sources for the threats and vulnerabilities that you will decide apply to your organization. And finally, Task 1-5 has you identify the risk model and analytic approach to be used. Remember when we described quantitative and qualitative approaches to conducting a risk analysis earlier in the semester? This is where that lesson applies. You can see from these tasks why this step is referred to as the prepare step. Step 2 is to conduct the assessment, which very much is the heart and most challenging part of a risk assessment, which includes 6 tasks. This is where the majority of the work will be performed. Task 2-1 is where you will identify the threats to your organization and systems. This includes both adversarial threats, such as criminal organizations, as well as non-adversarial threats, such as natural disasters. In Task 2-2, you will identify the different threat events that the threats might cause and their relevance. In Task 2-3, you expand your analysis a bit more by identifying the vulnerabilities that your systems may have that can be the target of a threat and threat event. Task 2-4 is where you get to do the one thing that I've consistently said is hard to do, and that is to determine the likelihood that the threat event will occur. Task 2-5 is much easier, as it is where you determine the potential impact should the threat events occur. Since this is based on an attack on a specific system, process, or data, the organization should be able to determine what the impact is to its mission, what that impact would be. And Task 2-6 is where you calculate the risk based on the information you determined in the previous steps. You've completed your analyses at this point as part of your assessment. Now you move on to the next step, which is much less involved. You must communicate the results of the assessment. This step includes only 2 tasks. The first, Task 3-1, consists of letting the organizational decision makers know what the results of your assessment are. Then, with Task 3-2, you share the risk-related information you determine to what NIST refers to as the appropriate organizational personnel. In other words, who needs to know about the potential risks, who might be able to influence them, or who may be influenced by them. The final step is to maintain the assessment, which also includes only 2 tasks. Task 4-1 has you monitoring the factors that might make a change in the calculated risk for your organization, system, or data. If a change occurs, then Task 4-2 states you need to update your risk assessment based on the new information for the change that has occurred. This doesn't mean that you need to conduct the entire risk assessment over again. You just need to go back and update the sections that are impacted by the change to see if the calculated risk has changed, and if so, then you need to determine what needs to be done to address the risk based on its newly calculated level of risk. It may result in no change if the level of risk has not changed or only changed a very small amount, or it may require you to go back and consider new controls or other ways to mitigate the risk if it has introduced a major rise in the level of risk. This is another diagram from 800-30 describing what NIST refers to as a generic risk model. I like it because it clearly identifies each point in the diagram. For example, you first start by identifying the possible threats or threat sources as they refer to them here. Then you identify the possible ways the threats can impact your organization or systems. These are referred to as threat events. It then identifies the possible vulnerabilities with any required conditions which may be potentially mitigated by your security controls. Then you determine the potential impact to the organization, and factoring in the impact and likelihood, you obtain the risk to your organization. If you read this across the diagram, you end up with a very concise description of what is taking place. A threat source initiates a threat event, which exploits a vulnerability, causing an adverse impact, which produces a risk to your organization. This, by the way, is what I would refer to as a risk analysis. Once you've completed all of your risk analyses, you can pull them all together and conduct the risk assessment, which you take a look at, where you take a look at things from an organizational perspective. You can then prioritize the risks as provided by the individual analyses. This will be a bit more complicated than just putting them in order of their risk values, because a mitigation strategy you utilize for one risk may actually help with another risk. This needs to be factored in. Let's review a list of some other documents we looked at this semester. In this case, this list points to various documents where you can find information on security controls that you might want to employ. We spent considerable time looking at these various documents because they are integral to the RMF, whether you use all NIST documents or some other set of controls. You will utilize these when you get to the section in the RMF where you select the security controls. There are a number of the factors that might influence which of these you use, to include the size of the organization, the level of security maturity of the organization, what sector the organization is in, any possible regulatory requirements the organization must adhere to, and the type of information that the organization processes. Here are a few more documents we looked at this semester, this time discussing assessments both in terms of an overall security assessment as well as ways to assess the security controls you may have selected. You may also have to meet the requirements associated with controlled, unclassified information if you process this level of information, and thus need to know how to assess those requirements. Our last review slide lists the documents where you can find information on incident recovery and the various plans that you might want to utilize in your organization in order to maintain continuity of operations. The information covered in this review is not all of the security issues that we discussed this semester, but are the major ones associated with the RMF. You will also find in your security career that you will run across the other issues such as information sharing, determining a return on investment for security, and security training and awareness. Whether you use the RMF or another framework in establishing a risk management program for an organization, the type of things we just covered are the issues that you will need to cover in development of a program. This course was about risk management. Hopefully, this final review of materials proved useful to you in tying everything together and seeing where all of the documents we reviewed this semester fit into a risk management program. It is time now to discuss the final exam. As with exam 1 and the quizzes, this is asynchronous, and you can take it any time during the final exam period, which extends from May 7th through May 13th. As with all other graded assignments in the class, it will be available on Canvas. You will have 120 minutes to take the exam. This is not a lot of time, so don't plan on being able to look up every question to find the correct answer. The exam is worth 200 points. This is 20% of your grade, so make sure you prepare for the exam. The exam is comprehensive and will cover all 15 modules and 25 lessons. There will be a slight heavier emphasis on the last modules and lessons since Exam 1. The exam will consist of 80 questions, and the format is like the other exam and the quizzes, meaning true-false, multiple choice, multiple answer, and a few fill-in-the-blank or short answer questions. It may also have other questions such as a matching format question. As with our quizzes and Exam 1, the final exam is an open notes exam, which means you can utilize the slides from the class, any notes you took when listening to the lesson, and any of the many documents we examined during the course. It should go without saying, but to make sure everybody understands, this is an individual effort graded assignment. You should not discuss the exam with anybody else. Here is the final list of useful documents. These are the ones I would download and keep around for your future reference, though as the documents get updated periodically, you might need to check at some later date to see if a document you want to use has been updated. There are no additional readings or videos for this lesson. There are also no additional review questions for this lesson. This is the end of Lesson 25, found in Module 15. It is the end of Module 15 and the end of the course.